Welcome to our podcast, Psychiatric Services from Pages to Practice. In this podcast, we highlight new research or columns published this month in the journal Psychiatric Services. I'm Lisa Dixon, editor of Psychiatric Services, and I'm here with podcast editor and my co-host, Josh Berzin. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Lisa.
How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Well, hanging in there. It's been a stressful time, I think, for everyone. Yeah, but I'm really excited today to do this podcast. We're going to be having Dr. Erik Messamore talking about state policies regarding medical marijuana. It's going to be really interesting. I did want to say a couple of things, though. One about this article. First, it is part of the Think Bigger, Do Good series commissioned by the Thomas Scattergood Behavioral Health Foundation, PEGS Foundation, the Patrick P. Lee Foundation, and another foundation, the Peter and Elizabeth Tower Foundation. And this is a part of a collaboration between the journal Psychiatric Services and the Think Bigger, Do Good series. And the full series can be viewed at www.thinkbiggerdogood.org. So I just wanted to do a shout out to this series, which I think really hits on some very, very key and important controversial issues. And I think you'll see that with our discussion today. I also wanted to mention that the audio is a little glitchy. Hope you hang in there with us. We're sort of using basic tools here in this COVID-19 era where we can't be in the same room. So we hope that you'll put up with it and enjoy the podcast. Let's get started.
So we're very happy to have Dr. Erik Messamore, who's an associate professor of psychiatry at the Northeast Ohio Medical University, to talk to us about his article that he co-wrote with Sarah Dugan on Informed Consent, a policy prescription for communicating benefit and risk in state medical marijuana programs. So Erik, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
And, we usually start out interviews with hearing a little bit about how people found their way into this particular aspect of research. So what was your kind of journey into getting interested in medical marijuana and policy around that?
Sure. Well, I came to medicine through a bit of a complicated pathway in that I got a PhD in pharmacology before I went to medical school. So with that background, you wind up getting lots of complicated cases that involve psychopharmacology and treatment non-response. I just call them complex cases. And the general rule of thumb when looking at people who have had poor or idiosyncratic responses to medications is to look at every single medicine that they're taking and try to understand whether it has been helpful or not helpful. And as much as possible to try to eliminate the things that are not clearly beneficial, because in the consultations that I would do, it's not uncommon to see people on 15 medicines, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And so in the early 2000s, when I started to do this, I would counsel my patients that were using cannabis to say, basically, you might want to consider putting a pause on your use of cannabis for a while so that we can see to what extent this may be contributing to the picture. And for years, by and large, most of my patients would either agree to it or at least they wouldn't be really argumentative about it. They would see the point of it. Whether they followed through or not was their decision. But that was sort of standard practice. And then I noticed that I think the first case that I noticed was around 2013. And I did my usual spiel about maybe we should pause the cannabis for a while. And then this young man started to tell me about how I was completely off base with that suggestion, how that people know that this is medicine, this is helpful, and that these reasons that I cited for considering to not take it, for example, that it's known to contribute to anxiety, are essentially stuff that extremists or prohibition activists are using to besmirch this medicine. And then, so I thought that was a one-off case, but then I would get that more and more often from my patients. So starting in 2014, 2015, I would get that a lot. And so I got very interested in why now are so many people changing their mind about the benefit to risk ratio of this substance. My main work is in working with people that have psychotic illnesses and schizophrenia, and the data are really clear. This is probably something that folks who are prone to psychosis or experiencing psychosis should absolutely not continue to use. But even there, I would find arguments to say that it's not true. And with more and more frequency, I would get this response, but it's medicine. The government wouldn't approve it as medicine if it really did all these awful things that you say. So that's how I got into really trying to understand what is being communicated to the public at large in medical marijuana policy, because I've seen many cases where misunderstanding of benefit and risk has really worked to the detriment of patients and their families.
So patients really told you and referred to the fact that there was officially medical marijuana and states had said it was okay, so therefore it's okay?
Exactly. In many cases, and then in many of my own consultations, my patients would bring that argument to me, and I saw so many of these cases, and to me they were heartbreaking, because from my point of view, there was a very clear correlation. Started using cannabis and then developed psychosis, or somebody with schizophrenia has psychosis, uses cannabis, goes to the hospital. And so the heartbreaking part was that it should be obvious to, I think, any third-party observer that this is harmful to this particular patient. But the reference to medicine and the there's no evidence that this can happen was frequently given back to me, and I got so discouraged by the frequency of that response that at that point I started to go online and make tweets about it or respond on Facebook or Quora or Reddit about the risks of cannabis. And when I started to do that, I would then get private messages from parents who described to me cases of their teenage children who had gotten in spectacular trouble related to cannabis use. And the parents as well said, but I tried to talk to my son, for example, and he says they wouldn't make it medicine if it did all these harmful things that you say.
So maybe we could step back for a second and you could give us like a broad overview of the state of medical marijuana legalization in the United States. When did states start legalizing medical marijuana, and how many states have approved it right now?
Sure. To talk about medical marijuana, I think it's worthwhile to just make a note that in ancient times, when all we had were herbal plants, in regions where cannabis grew, people naturally began to use it for medicinal purposes. Cannabis got introduced into Western medicine around the time of the British colonization of India, where cannabis is an endemic plant and had been used medicinally and ceremonially for millennia, presumably. So it was introduced to Western medicine in the middle of the 1800s. And between mid-1800s and early 1900s, you'll find textbook after textbook that talks about the medical uses of cannabis, and in many cases, the side effects and risks from it. And in one of those textbooks, it actually advises physicians about how many ounces of cannabis they should keep in their office and how much they should carry in their house call bag. Cannabis became illegal in the late 1930s and began to have a resurgence in popularity in the 1960s and 70s. The first state to create medical marijuana or to legalize marijuana for medical purposes was California in, I believe, 1996 through an act called Proposition 215. The history of that is that in the 90s, there was an AIDS epidemic that was growing, and we had no good treatments. And AIDS activists realized that using marijuana was a very good treatment for the loss of appetite and the body weight loss that was associated with AIDS. So largely to the good efforts of AIDS activists, polls were done and showed that there was broad public support for making cannabis available for medical uses in cases like that, for example. So California was the first to do this, and then a few years later, several more Western states adopted it. And at my last count was that 33 states plus the District of Columbia have enacted medical marijuana laws. I think approximately 10 of those have also legalized cannabis for recreational use.
Can you talk about that for a second? The difference between, because your article is really focused on medical marijuana, and I think it's an important distinction to make between legalization or authorization of medical marijuana versus recreational marijuana. So how does that tie into your discussion?
Sure. Well, in states that have within their state laws made marijuana legal for recreational use, it is kind of, as the title implies, you can use it for recreation, essentially for anything. If you are beyond the age of consent, then you're eligible to purchase marijuana products in stores that are allowed to operate in the state. And so practically anybody can buy practically any product for whatever use that they want out of it. States that pass medical marijuana laws say that if you have one of a certain number of things called qualifying conditions, then you're eligible to use marijuana as a part of a treatment for that qualifying condition. So a qualifying condition could be, for example, chronic pain. And if you can certify that you have a condition that leads to chronic pain, then you, in most cases, are allowed to get a card or a registration entry, which allows you to legally purchase cannabis from approved dispensaries in the state. The one exception to that qualifying condition policy is the state of Oklahoma, which basically says that a qualifying condition counts for anything that a doctor says that it could be used for. So Oklahoma hasn't listed qualifying conditions specifically. They've just said whatever a doctor approves it for, it can be used for.
And it seems like to kind of at least summarize the first part of the article, it seems like one thing that you're trying to explain is that we have a certain way that we think about what medicine is and how a regulatory process for approving medicines or approving the use of medicines, legalizing medicines, would normally go. But that isn't really what's happened with marijuana legalization, medical marijuana legalization, that there's this discrepancy in kind of what we think might be happening and what actually is happening. And so maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, correct. I mentioned earlier that I would hear from many of my patients something along the lines of, it can't be as harmful as you're trying to tell me, because otherwise the state wouldn't approve it as a medicine, or because it's medicine, or it's medicinal, how can it be that harmful? And I think that attitude is understandable in this particular point in history, because we have had for some 60 years now a process in which there's been one agency, the FDA, which approves medicines for human use. And to get approval from the FDA, a manufacturer has to present the FDA with a whole bunch of data from randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, more than one clinical trial, and that there has to be clear and convincing evidence that the medical claim is backed up by data, and as well that during the course of clinical trials, there has to be a deliberate observation for side effects or adverse events. So the FDA then makes a decision about the degree of benefit versus the degree of risk, and that's how we have drugs, which the public regards as safe and effective, which is sort of a tagline that the FDA, or a brand image from the FDA. What happens in state processes is absolutely not at all like that. So state processes go as follows. A group of citizens collects signatures on a ballot initiative, it goes on the ballot. Or a group of citizens collects signatures and it goes to the state assembly for consideration. And then a bill is crafted. A committee will be appointed to try to identify what are the qualifying medical conditions, who can grow what, where can we sell it. But it is all done by political mandate and with hopefully expert review of at least some science to support which conditions may be responsive. So there is no, in state approvals, there is no clinical testing, and there is no prospective assessment of risk. And actually, the point I try to make in the paper is that when it comes to risk, there's hardly any mention of risk in many state programs. So it's a massively different process with different priorities involved.
The comments that by your patients that, if there were risks, it wouldn't be approved. I mean, we know that all medicines have side effects, and some very, very severe problematic side effects. And so the notion that approval suggests the absence of side effects or harms is really completely untrue. And I guess it's just an interpretation or a wish, and maybe a reflection of the absence of a real process.
It is that is true, and I've noticed during my public speaking around cannabis risks that I get a fair amount of comments from people saying that the cannabis is way less harmful than pharmaceutical drugs, which have this, from the comments that I get, broad perception of having a lot of risks. And I think that behind that is, again, the FDA process for how we promote drugs to the public. So if any manufacturer wants to advertise on TV some new medicine, the rules in place say that if you're going to tell the public that if you're going to imply a benefit from a medicinal product, you have to say a whole bunch of risks. So at the end of television commercials, for example, the low voice, fast talking will say, and may produce fainting, bruising, and death. It always ends with death at the end.
Everything does.
So, yeah. And so because so there's that. So in advertising, you're obligated to say every single awful thing that could happen from a drug. And physicians are taught that we need to counsel our patients about all the things to look out for, the things that may go wrong. And pharmacists do this, and nurses do this, and they put these papers in the package that has this long list of all these awful things. So because we are so proactive in trying to advise people about the things that could go wrong with the medicine, of course, people are going to understand medicine to be a risky proposition, but that doesn't happen with cannabis. It doesn't have one corporate sponsor, and whoever sells it or promotes it has no obligation to disclose any side effects. And so there's that. And then there's just a general notion that natural things are somehow implicitly safe, which again is not entirely true. But there's a giant disconnect between public perceptions of risks around pharmaceutical drugs versus public perceptions around risks from cannabis. And I think a substantial portion of that disconnection has to do with the requirements for disclosing risks for pharmaceuticals versus other things.
It seems like one of the overlaps between the national FDA process or drug regulation in general and marijuana legalization is industry and lobbyists as well are playing a role in both of them. And that's also a part of as Lisa mentioned before, this idea of conflicts of interests being part of the equation here.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned lobbying. There's an organization called Open Secrets. I think their website is opensecrets.org, and you can track lobbying spending from various business interests. And so if you go to that website, you'll find that there has been, over the last several years, something like a 6,000% increase in the money that the cannabis industry is spending on lobbying. It's still the dollar amount that the cannabis industry is spending on lobbying is still significantly below the pharmaceutical industry, but that's a mature industry, and their lobbying spending has been stable. The fact that you see this very dramatic escalation of cannabis lobbying spending, I think, reflects the fact that business sees an opportunity, and so ramping up the spending to try to make laws favorable to people who are in the cannabis trade is a hot thing right now in politics.
Mm. So, the second half of your article is really about recommendations for what states should be doing differently now. So maybe you can just kind of walk us through what those areas are that you see as needing improvement.
Well, sure. I could summarize this very simply as follows. If a state government is going to say that marijuana is a medicine, then the state government should behave as if it really is a medicine. And we need only look to the way that we treat every other medicine in this country for a template. So if I want to bring, let's say, aspirin to market, then I'm going to say this willow bark derived drug, this willow bark derived miracle drug, it should be sold, and it can be used for pain, and it can be used for heart attack prevention, and it can be used for cancer prevention. I can make all these medical claims, which are actually, in this case, true for aspirin. And the state can say, great, you can sell your willow bark derived wonder drug in our state, but you have to let people know that there's a risk of bleeding, there's a risk of stomach problems, there's a risk of heart attack, and let people know that there's always some bad that comes with the good. So when we let medicines be marketed in the United States, we say that there's a requirement that you post side effects on the packaging, that we create websites that the public can just go to and see what are the side effects. I also argue that, go ahead.
Just in terms of the side effects and being transparent, another point that you made earlier I thought was really important, which is cannabis is not cannabis is not cannabis. So the side effects of one formulation, or with different compositions of cannabidiol and THC, might have very, very different side effects to another cannabis with another composition of those ingredients. And so that also really makes the whole endeavor seemingly very challenging.
That's correct. There was a guy who was active in medieval times. He goes by the Latin name Paracelsus. He's credited with one of the first textbooks of toxicology. And Paracelsus there's this quote attributed to Paracelsus that says, "Everything is poison. It's just the dose that determines whether it's poisonous or not." And I think that's one reason why every drug approved has specific doses that are approved, because we know that the higher the dose of something, the greater the risk. And one of the, I think, widely misunderstood things about medical marijuana is that medical marijuana is medical marijuana only if somebody uses to treat some medical illness. Medical marijuana doesn't imply low THC or high CBD. There's no chemical definition of medical marijuana. And if you look under the hood, if you look at the text of the legislation in the states that make medical marijuana laws, you'll see phrases that are similar to this one. Cannabis or marijuana in this bill is defined as anything that can be traced back to a marijuana plant or any derivative. That's very concerning language to me. In many states, they say any derivative of a chemical that comes from a marijuana plant, and there's no regulation about the strength or the dose. So when the FDA approves pharmaceutical THC for medical use, it says you can start at 2.5 milligrams per day or twice per day, and it has a maximum recommended dose of 15 milligrams per day. If you look to state medical marijuana laws, or what you can buy in a state dispensary from a medical marijuana state, you'll find that you can get THC capsules at 10 milligram strength with no guidance on dosing. You'll find that you can buy, for example, I just looked at the state of Minnesota a couple of days ago. You can buy a pre-filled syringe with THC oil for vaping, and one syringe will contain 1,500 to 1,520 milligrams of THC.
Wow.
So I think a lot of people, when I talk about medical marijuana with people who argue with me, they will say, no, you don't understand. Medical marijuana, and then they seem to say, is something that is plant-based, that has relatively low intoxicating THC and relatively high, presumably more medicinal CBD, but that's actually not at all what happens in state medical marijuana laws. Some medical marijuana products, in fact, are, as that category was described, low intoxication, high CBD, but others are essentially pure THC.
So you mentioned the people who argue with you, and one of the things that I like in the article is that in the conclusion, you take a moment to play devil's advocate, which I think is something that we don't often do when we're making a strong argument. So maybe you could take a second here to play devil's advocate as well. Like, what are some of the arguments that you hear that are maybe somewhat convincing to you, or at least you think are valid things to include in the debate? And then, why do you think that your position still stands?
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing that up, Josh. And in fact, I think listeners, if people are listening and they're thinking that Messamore is just some sort of prohibitionist crank who's against pot, I would like people to know, I lived in Oregon for a good number of years, and every single time that there was a petition to legalize pot, I signed it. And no matter where I live, I'm signing petitions that either decriminalize or legalize or liberalize drug policy laws. I think that the war on drugs has been a massive mistake, which has produced a tremendous amount of harm and very little good. So when it comes to cannabis, I actually believe that informed adults should be able to practice freedom to do whatever they want with their bodies. And that includes using cannabis if they choose without fear of prosecution. So I'm actually in favor, in principle, of having it legal. I'm not in favor of having it presented as a medicine that does 40 medical benefits and has 0 side effects because people get harmed that way. So to the point, what are the good points, or why ought we to consider legalizing marijuana, is because we live in a country that values freedom, and freedom to use a drug should be included in those freedoms. We live in a country that values democracy, or the will of the people. And when polls say that 60% or 70% or 80% of the public supports either full legalization or medical use of marijuana, a government should respond so that's in line with the value of democracy. And in fact, there's good evidence that marijuana does have medical value. It has really uncontested value in helping to relieve pain. It has very good value in relieving muscle spasticity, and it has at least moderate evidence to support many other beneficial medical uses. And so making it available for people who want it or who benefit from it is in line with the value of compassion. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to seriously rethink cannabis policy, and why it's not a bad idea to have it available legally. It's just, my point is, if we need to do this carefully, because the current movement for legalization has been really about branding marijuana as a safe, natural, side effect-free medicine. And no medicine is as safe and side effect-free as marijuana seems to be portrayed in many state policies.
So, and these aren't hypothetical objections that you've gotten. You actually heard objections from advocates. Yeah. What are some of those objections, and how have you responded to them?
My position has always been that we need to be really clear and comprehensive about communicating risks, and that those risks should be very conspicuously displayed on packaging or on state medical marijuana program websites. Feedback that I get from advocates say that we don't really know for sure that all these risks that people like the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine are publicizing, we don't know if those risks are actually true. They point to the fact that a lot of what the National Academies of Sciences has opined about is based on correlational studies. And my response to that is that National Academy of Sciences was independent. They have no skin in the game as far as prohibition or legalization. And in their opinion, the side effects, the 13 risks that they deem to have at least moderate support for, are valid. And I would also say that we need to only look as far as FDA registrational clinical trials to get gold standard side effect data. THC is legitimate FDA-approved medicine, and it went through clinical trials, which generated a good amount of side effect data. And if we can sell THC in dispensaries, why don't we simply include the warnings that other THC has to have with it? Other objections that I get are that we simply need more data. It's premature to make conclusions about side effects and risks. And my response is that it wasn't premature to unleash it to the public and label it as a medicine. So it's similarly not premature to let the public know that there could be some side effects or some bad outcomes for some people. And then another common argument that I get is that all this talk about risks like psychosis or panic attack or cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome are something that hasn't been documented in the 5,000 years that humanity has been using cannabis. And my response to that is that for most of the history of humankind and cannabis was 2 or 3% THC plant. And nowadays, under modern medical marijuana laws, legally cannabis can be nearly pure THC at concentrations and forms that have never been found in nature. So those are my responses to the common arguments that I get against going public in a big way about communicating side effect risks.
Well, I really appreciate the inclusion of alternate points of view, and it just reflects a really thoughtful position that I think you lay out really well in the article itself. And it's been fascinating having you on. We rarely cover 5,000 years of history on the podcast, and so it's been a real pleasure, and I've definitely learned a lot. So thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you again.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Messamore, for a really informative discussion. That's it for today. We invite you to visit our website, ps.psychiatryonline.org, to read the article we discussed in this episode, as well as other great research. Also, we remind you to check out the Editor's Choice topic collections available now. And I want to do a particular shout out to the collection called Mental Health Disparities by Race and Ethnicity of Adults. Very timely. This collection was put together by Dr. Ayana Jordan, and guess what? We're going to be interviewing her on next month's podcast. We welcome your feedback. Please email us at psjournal@psych.org. I'm Lisa Dixon.
I'm Josh Berzin.
Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time.